Yeah, let me say a few words in the wake of what Stephen said. First of all, Asle, NATO has never said that Ukraine will not become a member of the alliance. This is a black and white issue. Either you say that or you don't say that. To say that it's not going to happen for a while, it might not ever happen, is not satisfactory to the Russians. The Russians are making it perfectly clear that we have to say that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO. And that has not been said. And you're implying that it has been said. It has not been said. This is a very black and white issue. The second point is Ukraine is in the process of becoming a de facto member of NATO. We are arming the Ukrainians. We are training the Ukrainians. We have close diplomatic relations with the Ukrainians. We emphasize that we care greatly about their security, even if we won't fight for them. We talk about them in the context of our allies and partners. The rhetoric is used all the time. If you're on the Russian side and you see the Ukrainians being armed, you see the Ukrainians being trained by NATO forces, you see NATO leaders talking about Ukraine as if it were a de facto member of the alliance, you don't think this is going to really upset the Russians? You've been studying great power politics for a long time. You know how great powers behave. They're paranoid about their security. They intensely dislike the idea of another great power with its military alliance marching up to its border. So again, we have not said that NATO will not eventually bring Ukraine into the alliance. And we are now in the process of making it a de facto member of the alliance. And this is a prescription for disaster. Now, you say maybe this is due to the fact that Joe Biden is weak. This crisis has been on the front burner for a long time. It started in February 2014, and Joe Biden was not the president. Barack Obama was the president, right? The crisis has gone on since then, right, to include the period when Donald Trump was president, and it continues today. And it is going to go on and on as long as we refuse to say some very simple words. Ukraine will not become part of NATO.
But I have to ask you both then, how is this different from Munich? How is this different from, I guess that was 1938, when the British tried to buy peace in Europe by agreeing to a small East European country being dismembered by a great power, claiming security interests? And how would it be possible in order for the West to make such a statement without seeming to underwrite the partitioning and devouring of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, which I'm sure the Western powers will not be willing to do, because it would mean that we are no longer subscribing to the core tenet of the international order.
This bears no resemblance to Munich. The idea that Vladimir Putin is the second coming of Adolf Hitler and that Russia today is the second coming of Nazi Germany is simply not a serious argument. Furthermore, nobody is talking about dismembering Ukraine the way Czechoslovakia was dismembered in October 1938 at Munich. That is not what is happening here. What we're talking about is effectively moving away from an effort on the part of the United States and its allies to turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark. And if you're looking for an analogy here, the analogy is the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets tried to put military forces in Cuba. It enraged the United States. And if you look at our relations with Cuba today, we still have sanctions on Cuba. We still have our gun sights on Cuba. Why? Because the thought that those Cubans would invite distant great power into the Western Hemisphere bothered us so greatly then that it has continued to this day. That's the basic situation that you have in Eastern Europe today. The Russians don't want Ukraine to become a member of NATO in the same way that the United States did not want Cuba to become an ally of the Soviet Union armed with nuclear-tipped missiles from the Soviet Union. But this has no parallel whatsoever with Munich in 1938.
Sure, and if I could just...
Do you think that there are any parallels, or do you subscribe to the Cuban Missile Crisis analogy?
Oh, I think that's a useful analogy. I think another one could be Austrian neutrality in the Cold War, a way of preserving Austria's sovereignty and independence, not undermining it, not undermining any important international rules. The whole point of a diplomatic agreement between the West and Russia would be to preserve the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine in what may well be the only practical way it can be preserved. And there would be no tolerance whatsoever of aggression against Ukraine. Not incorporating a country into a particular military alliance, that is not a violation of any international rules and norms. And I think there's a bit of inflation, rhetorical inflation about the rules when I see members of the Biden administration or other leaders talk about a sacrosanct right of countries to join whatever security arrangements they desire. There is a right to apply, but the right goes only that far. There is no obligation by NATO to admit any other country. It would be absurd if that were to happen. NATO would collapse because a whole slew of countries would seek to join. They would automatically be admitted, and no one would believe that the Article 5 guarantee would be credible. So this is obviously not a way to run international politics.
Professor Mearsheimer and Dr. Wertheim, from a European perspective, I'm sure many of us have been wrong-footed by the depth and animosity of the emerging crisis over Ukraine. But it plays into a different aspect that is difficult for us to comprehend, and which I hope that you can help us shed some light on. And that is the current divisions in the United States over foreign policy. You see, in Europe, we have grown accustomed to the United States being a country where you can quarrel about pretty much anything, but you stand shoulder to shoulder over the broad tenets of American foreign policy. That does not seem to be the case anymore. So can you please lay out your views on what characterizes the core camps, the big camps in terms of American foreign policy right now?
Right now, I think what we're not seeing, first of all, is the resurgence of isolationism. I don't see that. Donald Trump was called an isolationist, but Donald Trump's most enduring foreign policy legacy might well be to lead the charge in a new Cold War with China. That doesn't sound like any kind of isolationism, even a caricatured kind that we can think of from the history of the 20th century. What I think we are seeing, though, are sort of two coherent demands emerging that take account of the demise of the unipolar moment. One of them is an orientation toward great power competition, with China far and away being the more significant competitor than Russia. In fact, perhaps that position has even morphed into a more determined desire to contain or counterbalance Chinese power in the Asia Pacific. And you can see that trend, beginning with the Obama administration announcing a pivot to Asia a decade ago. But then there's also something else brewing, which is a demand for restraint more or less across the board. And that doesn't mean pulling all U.S. forces home from outside the Western Hemisphere, but it does mean taking account of what America's priorities truly are at this point in the 21st century. Internationally, it might mean focusing on climate change. We can add to that pandemic disease, which are threats that arguably affect the American people more than the conventional threats of even the Chinese military. And most of all is a demand by the American public, a very discontented American public, to take care of problems at home, including crumbling infrastructure and a quite acute crisis in American governance, with ever increasing animosity and polarization between the parties. And at a minimum, this is a hugely absorbing task for any president of the United States to deal with. And so that's part of the reason why these two trends, they can coexist together for some time. I mean, they converged around in Afghanistan. Ending the war in Afghanistan is good if your goal is great power competition. It's good if your goal is restraint internationally and more of a domestic focus. At some point, we'll see more of a frontal divergence between those two positions. But as I said in my opening remarks, we see inertia reigning in America's overall global position. And so the demand both for focus on China and for restraint and domestic priorities, those remain compelling.